Hello, everyone, and welcome into the Go 24/7 podcast. Week 3 is upon us. Bryce Koon alongside Glen West. If you're listening, we appreciate you. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to hit that subscribe, like the video, whatever you might be able to do. Leave us a comment, leave us a review. It's okay, whatever you want to do. Glenn, I don't know if you saw on YouTube, I got a couple comments that I need to add in some LSU material behind me on the last YouTube video. So I've scorched eBay for some memorabilia that's in the mail on the way. So for the LSU fans watching, that'll be good. But hey, Mississippi State this weekend, Glenn. It's going to be a fun one. We're going to head to Starkville for Saturday, an 11 a.m. kickoff. As we open it up here, how excited are you to see the Tigers open up SEC play and in a place? It's going to be loud and it's going to be packed out for an 11 a.m. kick.
Yeah, I think I'll probably pop a couple Advil before we head into the game to avoid any headache concerns for the cowbells that we're expected to hear. It's going to be my first time as well to Mississippi State. It's a good four or 5 hour drive. We're going to be staying in Columbus and then drive in for the game. So, but we're I think it's going to be a fun atmosphere. Haven't heard a whole ton outside of obviously the cowbell situation and all that, but should be a great, kind of first test, I think, for this team. There's been questions. I mean, Brian Kelly was asked today about, the noise and the crowd levels for an SEC game and, how it might differ for a Mississippi State game than others. And Brian Kelly essentially said this morning that he has never been a part of a cowbell game before. It has never been to Mississippi State. So it's going to be a learning experience for him. It's going to be a learning experience, I think, for a lot of these players. But in the end, I just don't. I think this is going to be a game that's it's going to be defined by the offenses and just kind of which defense can cobble together enough stops down the stretch. I do think this is going to be a pretty high scoring game. Just initial thoughts on it. Do think that Mississippi State's run game is very prolific. I mean, I think they have a guy in Jaquavius Marks who might be the best runner in the SEC this year. He's already leading the conference in rushing yards, and it's going to be a challenge, I think, for this LSU defense. I mean, we've talked about it a lot here these first couple weeks, but I think there should be a level of concern about about how these guys are going to perform in SEC play on the defensive side of the ball. You have question marks, I think, at a lot of different levels on this defense. And I think it starts with tackling, which I'm sure we'll get into more a little bit as we kind of get the pod going. But I do think that this is going to be kind of one of those good gauges, good tests marks to see what kind of improvement they've made in 2 weeks since that Florida State fiasco. So I'm excited to see it. And now you got, you kind of, you're going full speed ahead into SEC play here over the next 5 weeks. And I think this next month or so is really going to define LSU season as a whole.
Yeah, and I was telling someone earlier in the week, I mean, how important it is for LSU to kind of get off to a hot start with kind of what's transpired over the first 2 weeks in the SEC West in particular. It doesn't look like there's a bona fide leader kind of to take the crown. And so LSU, even like you said, after that fiasco in Orlando, still has everything out in front of them. And I know that's something that Brian Kelly has talked about as well. All the goals are still there, much like last season. We kind of roll into the defense, and look, we had a chance to talk with Mekhi Wingo last night. If you go back to last year's game, and Robbie Falk of the Mississippi State Site 24/7 did a fantastic job on our podcast. If you haven't checked that out, I'll link it down below. We recorded that yesterday with him, and he said, look, last year Mississippi State was made one-dimensional, and it didn't work. Now, Kevin Barbay, the offensive coordinator for the Bulldogs, has a more balanced approach, much like you talked about Jaquavius Marks. I think he's like 250 yards, 3 scores already so far this season. It seems like the goal is to make them one-dimensional. Now, Mekhi Wingo welcomed the challenge of saying, hey, when a team wants to run on you, it's kind of a challenge to that defensive line. Do you feel like that's the goal in this game? The LSU needs to make them one-dimensional, make Will Rogers beat them with his arm, or make them beat them on the ground?
I think so. I mean, the second half against Florida State and really the first quarter and a half against Grambling, LSU really struggled, I think, defensively on the run game. I mean, their fits were not great. They were not always in the right packages to stop the run. That made them kind of susceptible to longer gains. I think that they're going to have it's going to be a big test. This first game against Jaquavius Marks and a couple of the other complementary backs they work in with their system. they're going to be a great challenge for LSU. I think that Mekhi Wingo, Mason Smith, Savion Jones, Quincy Wiggins, Ovie Gofu, Braden Swinson, all those guys are going to need to be much better at stopping the run, at kind of filling those gaps and making sure that they're not getting pushed around for open holes. The physicality steps up, obviously from last weekend, and how they handle that and how they handle the backs and just how they operate with what they're doing. They run a lot of zone runs. They like to get to the outside and the perimeter, just like Florida State did. So they're going to be a complete running team. I mean, this is very different than what LSU faced last year with the air raid. This is a zone run team that they like to double team guys and get holes open that way on the defensive side of the ball. So it's going to be a real challenge. I think the linebacker group too, it can be mixed in with this, with Harold Perkins and Omar Spates, Greg Penn. I would like personally, I thought that the Weeks brothers both played pretty well against Grambling. Yeah. Wouldn't mind seeing them get some opportunities as this game kind of moves along if you're still struggling. So I think it's really just going to come down to LSU being pretty gap sound, and making sure that they're tackling and wrapping up. I mean, that's the most important thing, because another thing that they did not do a very good job of in at least the first quarter and a half or so against Grambling was tackle and get those guys to the ground. So that needs to be very much improved at all levels. And I think if you're able to kind of slow the run down, you kind of get into what worked so well for you last year, and you hope that the secondary has made strides to really kind of help you out there in the back half of the defense.
Glenn, you mentioned obviously the run game is going to be a big part of what Mississippi State wants to do, but they've got to be able to find that balance. Will Rogers, veteran quarterback, to me, one of the better quarterbacks that returned in the SEC, just from a numbers statistics standpoint. Rogers hasn't pushed the ball down the field a ton. It does feel like this is an opportunity, and I asked Robbie Falk the same question. I wanted to ask you, Glenn, when you look at this offense, we talked about Jaquavius Marks. We talked about the run game. It's a pivotal part of Mississippi State's success. But, Will Rogers, the guy they have under center, is a smart guy. He's played a lot of football. I played a lot of football at Mississippi State. And although it's a new scheme, he hasn't pushed the ball down the field a lot. But I think that LSU is going to have to respect the fact that you have a guy who knows what he can do with the football, has some good receivers on the outside. How do you see this matchup kind of brewing between Will Rogers and that LSU secondary that, let's just be honest, needs a good performance against a high-quality opponent?
Yeah, they certainly do. I think Will Rogers is the kind of guy that you can really get a good test on, just of how far you think this defense has come. Obviously, LSU played a lot of Denver Harris last weekend. They played a lot of Zy Alexander, and they kept kind of Major Burns and Greg Brooks and Andre Sam as kind of that trio of safeties. But they rotated Deuce Chestnut in a little bit as well. But it's going to be a big test. I mean, I think that it's going to really come down to tackling for LSU and making sure that they're keeping guys in front of them. That was one of the big issues that I think you saw against Florida State, was them allowing the runners to get by them, and then they were able to recover for the most part, but they were out of position, and they allowed those gigantic receivers to kind of have their way in the second half in particular. So I do think that this is going to be a Mississippi State offense that balances the run and the pass. Will Rogers hasn't taken a ton of chances. I mean, Jaquavius Marks, I believe, has 8 receptions, and he's kind of the second leading receiver, I think, on the team right now. So they're still figuring it out. They've had some ups and downs as an offense as well, especially last weekend against Arizona, where Mississippi State's defense was able to turn them over 5 times, but it took overtime to really punch those guys out. So I think that just goes to show you just some of the growing pains they're still going through as an offense. LSU is certainly going through some of their own growing pains as a defense right now. And so if they're able to kind of put together 3 or 4 quarters here, and they can feel really good about themselves heading into what's going to be a really strong SEC conference schedule for them.
Yeah, another note on Jaquavius Marks. He's getting and inching closer to the all-time receptions record at Mississippi State as a running back, because he was so involved in that air raid offense. But like you mentioned, he's a multifaceted weapon. I mean, through the air, obviously on the ground as well. It's going to be something that LSU's got to keep an eye on. Glenn, a topic that a lot of people are kind of interested in seeing is the expectations for this LSU offense. I mean, look, it's no secret that you saw some positive things. You and I talked about it, in that instant reaction pod, that we saw some things we liked out of this group. How does that translate to an SEC opponent on the road? And look, I guess it starts and ends with Jaden Daniels. I mean, what do you feel like and you need to see from this group to feel confident when we leave Starkville?
Yeah, I mean, we're about to find out a lot, I think, about this offense. And the one area that I'm looking at very closely, and I wrote about it on Wednesday. I touched on it some in earlier pieces this week. I'm looking at the run game, and I
Mm.
really am excited to see kind of what Logan Diggs looks like and against an SEC opponent, how this offensive line holds up against some stiffer competition this weekend. Big talking point has obviously been what Zalance Hurd's been doing for you at right tackle, how they're going to continue working him in with Emory Jones at guard. And we were talking with Emory yesterday in player interviews on Tuesday, and he seemed to think that they were making some real strides in the run game. He had a lot of positive things to say about the backs and about all the ways they're going to be able to utilize not only just Diggs, but now you have John Emery back for this game. You have
Mm.
Caleb Jackson, who rushed for 60 yards and 2 touchdowns last week as a true freshman. They have some real playmakers, I think, that they're starting to tap into with their potential. But this is going to come down to Diggs. I think that Diggs can really cement himself as the feature guy in this backfield with another strong performance. And it's going to take, obviously, a team effort, but the offensive line is going to have to get that push that we saw against Grambling. They're going to have to replicate that and make sure that they can do it against teams like this, because they're going to face a lot of them here over the next 5, 6, 7, 8 weeks. They're going to face some stiff defensive fronts, and it's going to be extremely important that they find some complements with what they're trying to do in the passing game and Jaden Daniels. So I'm having all eyes on the run game this weekend. I think if they are able to really get Diggs going and get him as a big part, 15 or so touches in this game between the run and pass, that would be very, very good. I think if you're LSU to kind of get that kind of production, because that means that something's working. And if you're able to get
Yeah.
him 10, 11, 12, 13 carries, it means that you're moving the ball. You're finding some good balance, and then working in, obviously, these immensely talented receivers and that have had a little bit of an up and down start as well, but seem to have, at least for the short term, rectified some of those dropping issues that they were having in that Florida State game.
Yeah, you talked about the receivers. Look, it has to be a balanced attack for LSU. I mean, Zach Arnett's a good defensive mind over there for Mississippi State. We obviously talked with Emory Jones yesterday, like you mentioned, and he said, "Look, Mississippi State doesn't have a guy. Like they don't have a guy that's going to be drafted in the top 10, but they've got a lot of good players. They're going to do a lot of pre-snap movement. So I think it's on Jaden Daniels to be able to read that, on the communication up front, to be able to help with those assignments, which way you're slanting, which way you're going." Another thing, talking with Malik Neighbors, we know who Neighbors is. And I know a guy that you've been excited to kind of see is Brian Thomas. He had a nice game. I mean, he truly did have a good game against Florida State. It felt like it was just overshadowed by so many other mistakes from everyone else. You had Brian Thomas. Chris Hilton is another guy that I think, I mean, if all those weapons click in this game, Glenn, I think that, you're going to have a lot of folks back on the bus, back on the train where LSU's offense could go. But I mean, if I'm telling you that you're watching the run game, I'm going to keep my eye on the receivers. I think if Chris Hilton can continue to show that, like Brian Kelly said, he wants to be more complete, but obviously has the potential to take the top off. I mean, how excited do you think the fan base would be? And we'll get into our final thoughts here in a second. But how excited if LSU shows a balanced attack, covers the spread, wins this game? I mean, do you think it kind of cements some of the concern and maybe turns the tide a little bit with where LSU wants to head, maybe from the fan base?
Yeah, I think it turns a little bit. I still think you need to string it together for several weeks
Mm.
to believe it. I think the Arkansas game will be another great challenge for this offense, but I do think that LSU is kind of in a spot here where if they put together a good performance here, that they at the very least build confidence and momentum heading into the meat of their SEC schedule here. I'm with you on the receivers. I think that um, we're still waiting to kind of see that explosion from the passing game. I mean, they were very efficient last week. They did what they were supposed to do. Um, week one, their first half, I thought was very good. They got themselves in scoring position 5 out of the 6 drives, didn't capitalize down in the red zone, obviously, and you had a bunch of miscues in the second half that really soured, I think, the overall performance of the first half. But you have guys that can make plays on this team. I mean, I think that they it's really going to be about Daniels being aggressive and taking those risks and taking those chances with his arm, which we still, I think, haven't seen a whole ton of. I mean,
Yeah.
he's thrown a couple out there, but he's been also missing a couple. I mean, there was one that I remember down the sideline. I believe it was to Malik Neighbors last week against Grambling that would have gone for a touchdown. Overthrew him by I think maybe a foot or two, and Neighbors just wasn't able to bring it in. You mentioned the Brian Thomas connection. I think that those two have really kind of built a nice rapport in the first 2 weeks. I'd like to see that continue. I want to see them get Mason Taylor more involved, though. I
Yeah.
think he's the guy that really has a chance to be a good. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous to put it this way, but a safety net for him. He's going to be a
Yeah.
good kind of last option, I think, for him in terms of just drop backs and kind of reading his progressions. I think they need to make sure that he's not just that, though. He needs to be a guy
Mhm.
that is targeted often, especially down in the red zone. I think he's a guy that can make linebackers and slot guys really shake, and I think that they need to find a way to get him more involved. So I bullet point answer is I think offense still has a lot to prove. Defense still has a lot to prove. And this weekend is going to go a long way in telling us just how far they are to at least correcting course on this season.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's a proving ground. This is a chance to really gain some momentum, and like you said, really prove your worth both on both sides of the football. To kind of see, hey, are those preseason expectations, were they a little too ludicrous, or is this something where you can kind of right the ship and get back to where you want to? Because, like we mentioned, this is a wide open SEC West. After what happened over the past couple of weeks, it doesn't look like any team's dominant. Still way too early, but you have to kind of grow as the season. And this team will grow. You just hope it's in the right direction. We wrap it up here. Predictions and final thoughts. Glenn, I'll hand it to you. Where do you go with this game? I think it's a 10.5-point spread. Is LSU covering, or Mississippi State going to make this closer? How do you feel about this game?
Yeah, I think LSU gets in the range of covering. I mean, I'm kind of sitting in the camp of 35, 28, 30, 34, 24, something like that. I think that LSU's defense is going to respond well. We didn't really talk about it a whole ton, but Mississippi State's offense has had some lull moments there
Mm-hmm.
throughout the course of their first 2 games where they've really struggled to get things going. And I think LSU is going to have to take advantage when that happens, whether it's early in the game, whether it's late in the game, or somewhere kind of in the middle. I think LSU's offense is going to have to go on a run and score 10, 17, 20 points in a row to really feel good about this game. But yeah, I think that they cover. I think that they get 8, 9, 10-point win, and you feel really good about yourself heading into next weekend. But the most important thing I want to see is just progress made in the secondary, progress made with their tackling, progress made with the offense and the run game in particular. I think is going to be extremely, extremely important to get that going against some stiffer competition. If they can do that, then I think that it opens up a boatload of possibilities going forward with how you operate as an offense and what you can rely on here down the stretch of your season.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. Glenn, I think we've been almost identical in our picks the past couple of weeks. I'm going 35-23. I do think LSU covers, and I do agree with you. Mississippi State has had some lulls. I think that maybe they have one of those lulls in this game. LSU's defense steps up, and the offense can kind of really start to lean on them, especially, and we talked about it, maybe a physical ground game for LSU starts to take a toll on a Mississippi State defense that I think is solid, but I don't know if it has the depth to keep up with LSU for a full 60 minutes. It's going to be interesting to watch as well. As Glenn mentioned, we've had some great content over on Go 24/7. Make sure you check that out. LSU.247sports.com. Fantastic content, player interviews, coach interviews. We're going to have great stuff coming through the week, recruiting information as well. Glenn, I know last week was a big week for basketball. Both men and women's basketball had some big time recruits on campus, so you can go check out some of that information as well. He's Glen West. I'm Bryce Koon. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Go 24/7 podcast. We'll catch you later on the week with a recruiting pod as Sonny and I will hop on, talk the latest in LSU recruiting, and then we'll have that instant reaction podcast from Starkville this Saturday. We'll see you next time.